Alright guys, sorry it's been so long, but it's about time I made another video. And because it's taken me so long, I figured I'd get the big one done, my top 10 personal anime series. No further introduction required, let's get on with the countdown. My number 10 entry for this list is Death Note. Now Death Note was one of the first animes I ever watched, and it was probably single-handedly the anime that officially made me want to start getting into anime, as the unique premise of this show captivated me enough to want to find out what else was out there in the anime world besides like people with powers beating each other up, or like playing card games and stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with those kinds of shows, by the way, as you'll find out in this list. But yeah, Death Note's been a long time favourite of mine now. The premise alone makes it a must-watch. It kickstarts with a bang when overachieving young man Light Yagami comes across a magic book called the Death Note, which as long as he knows the full name and face of a person, it allows him to kill all the criminals in the world, all from the comfort of his own room. A position where he thinks no one will be able to catch him doing it. Or so he thinks, until the day when he finds a foe who simply calls himself L, who uses amazing deductive capabilities to narrow him down, regardless of how supernatural the situation is. What's great about this series is that we see how having too much power and having a great challenge from an equal mind can bring out somebody's true colours. We see that Light starts to stretch his hit list out from just killers to pretty much anybody who gets in his way, including the police, while he's having the mind battle of the century, essentially leading to Light's corruption. We even see him use manipulation, particularly on a girl called Misa, who Light happens to have done justice for by killing her parents' murderer. And because Misa looks up to him so much for this, she always offers to help herself in whatever way she can, and Light takes full advantage of this by often putting her into dangerous situations that can help him in his goals, but regardless of what consequences can fall on her. L, on the other hand, has to put himself into dangerous situations in order to narrow down on Light. After L deduces that this killer needs a name and a face in order to execute a kill, he even goes as far as to introduce himself to Light once he's narrowed down on him enough, so that he can observe his movements more closely. Now that's taking a risk. So essentially what Death Note boils down to is a great battle of wits between two minds who are trying to get their hands on the other. L has to figure out exactly how Light is killing people and be able to prove that it is him doing it, while Light has to figure out L's real name and kill him without anybody being able to immediately conclude it was him. The story does take a bit of a downhill drop once we enter the last third, mainly because the story kind of changes really, and that does hurt Death Note's placement on this list. However, I'm not going to condemn the whole series just because I didn't like the last third as much as the rest of it, because overall it's still great entertainment, and like I said, it's been a long time favourite of mine and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Number 9 is Gurren Lagann. Sorry if you can't tell that from this, by the way. I happen to get my hands on a regionless one, you know, one that doesn't have any restrictions on like what country you can play it in. However, they seem to have scrimped a bit on the fucking design of this, because you cannot see a fucking thing. Maybe if I did this, let's see. Yeah, you can sort of see the black sunglasses to it like that. Ah, there we go. Ah. Now, Gurren Lagann is completely implausible, the villains are mostly all stock, the story has been done to death, and it has horrendously cheesy dialogue, but I wouldn't have it any other way. What Gurren Lagann has that makes everything I just said work to his advantage is unprecedented levels of passion, big personalities in the characters, and an enormous sense of scale that have me sucked in from start to finish. Oh, there's just so many great scenes in this show, like whether it be a bunch of drills coming out of nowhere and going blowing stuff up, and like massive explosions blowing shit up. Oh, the show gets me so pumped up. And I know it might sound very shallow to use points like that to support why something's good. After all, that's the Michael Bay way of doing things. But it just goes without saying, as well as entering a world that has mechs that operate on fighting spirit somehow, you also enter a world of adventure, rebellion, great action, comedy, drama, and tits. Well, we have to have something out there for the people who only watch anime for fan service. And the characters are done very well, and Seaman in particular I thought was an extremely well developed character from the changes that we see him from when he's a kid to like when he's a man later on. And even though most of the villains are just typical bad guys, I thought what they did with Lord Jerome and Viola was actually pretty good. And although the plot is just another rebels rising against the powers that be story, it does throw some of its own twists into the mix that keep it about as fresh of a show as its artwork does. Yeah, I love the artwork of these characters in this series. I love how it just all looks like some sort of elaborate graffiti project that you'd see on some wall somewhere. It lacks originality, but Gurren Lagann is fantastically executed. It's just a really good fun Super Robo anime, and if you have any sort of craving for top class action-packed stuff, then this is one that you have to see. My 8th favourite anime is Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Now, I did like the original Fullmetal Alchemist series, but I do think there were problems with it. The villains were pretty rubbish, especially the main villain, Dante. The animation wasn't particularly good, especially for the time it was made. The conclusion wasn't particularly satisfying, and most of the changes from the manga did it more harm than good, for the most part. All of those problems were fixed in Brotherhood. The story was handled much better, which is no surprise since it follows the original manga pretty much to the book from what I understand. Much better way of doing things than what the original did and do it half and half. This fact makes Brotherhood probably the only shonen I've seen that has a completely solid storyline from start to finish. The backstory to this world that we find bits about as we go along integrates fantastically into the main storyline, and the main plotline always has you hooked and makes you want to find out what's going to happen next from start to finish. Also, the animation is fantastic, fluid and rarely ever cuts a corner. This allows for some great alchemy battles and some brilliant hand-to-hand combat fights too. And last but not least, the characters were much better developed. Each one of them seems to have their place a lot more in the Brotherhood series, and that goes double for the villains and triple for the main villain. So you might be thinking, if I think so highly of this series, like I'm pretty much top-notching every category, why is it only 8th place on the list? Well, as much as I know that I'm going to get flamed for this, I have to admit, there is one big problem I have with this series, and that is the overuse of comic relief. This series just tries way too hard to be funny, and I'm sorry, but I just did not find it that funny. Most of the jokes were just really forced, like that sort of humour that just seems to be distracting from the main story just so that it doesn't seem so heavy, but it's not really necessary to do so. I mean, there were a few funny characters, don't get me wrong, and I appreciate the humour when it works. For example, I thought Armstrong was pretty funny, I thought Mustang had a good line every now and again, Hughes was amusing for a while with his whole showing people his like daughter picture and all that. And Barry the Chopper, I actually thought what he did with Barry the Chopper was pretty funny, so there are some characters that I thought were funny. Aside from them though, short jokes or some other stupid shit, and like I said, just forced humour that take away from the story that just don't really add anything and aren't really that funny in my opinion. And I know it's not appropriate to like rip on a massive problem I have with a series when I'm supposed to be demonstrating that these are my top 10 series, but I really think in this case I need to, because I know that just simply talking the good stuff about this anime and saying it's my 8th favourite will probably have a lot of people saying, "Why isn't Brotherhood at #1, you bastard?" Don't worry, I love the series overall. Great story, great characters, great action, all that sort of good stuff. Just the comedy I really could have done backed off. But it's still good enough to be number 8 on my list, which as far as I'm concerned is a very high ranking. Number 7 I don't have on DVD, and I'm kind of glad about that, because if I happened to own all of this I probably would have no money because it's one of the longest fucking animes ever made. It's One Piece. Now One Piece is kind of similar to Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood in the sense that it likes to rely on comedy as a big part of creating atmosphere and telling its story. However, in One Piece it works much better, and when I say that I mean it's one of the funniest shows I've ever seen. It's easily the anime that I've laughed the hardest at while watching. I'm not entirely certain why it works better, but I think it's just because the comedy just seems to come much more naturally from the personalities of the characters instead of jokes for the sake of jokes. But aside from humour, one of the other factors that makes One Piece one of my favourites is it's probably the only long-running shonen that's done a highly commendable job of keeping itself fresh. And just how many episodes has it been now? Like 650, 700, something like that. And I think the reason it's getting away with it is because the adventure aspect to it is just so captivating. The characters travel to just so many great creative lands that each have their own rules and like systems of government in place and all that sort of thing. Like they go to water worlds, they go to cloud worlds, they go to sand worlds, they go to worlds where everything's massive. Did I say water worlds already? I don't know. And character-wise, all the people in all the different worlds seem to act differently from the last. This always makes me wonder, where are the characters going to end up next time? Of course, I'm going to be honest here, because the series is so long and I'm just so busy with my full-time job, I'm only really halfway through, like 300 episodes in or so. But I'm not bored of the series or anything, I love the series. I'm just too busy that I just can't justify watching like 300 episodes of series. But I can't say that I'm bored by the series or anything, because like I say, I'm always wondering what's going to happen next. Characters are also done really well. They have great varied personalities and they balance each other out nice. And as well as balancing out each other perfectly, they also have great interactions with each other. A lot of that going towards the more funny moments of the show. And they also interact greatly with the world that they live in as well. As well as wondering where the character's going to end up next, I also look forward to the new crew member who's going to end up joining them, just to find out what their personality is going to be and what their deal is. As well as this, it also has some of the best fight scenes in anime and has one of the best powers. A lot of the time in anime, they always try and make powers really overly explained. One Piece on the other hand goes for the approach of, hey, this is the world, it has its own rules, we have magical fruits that give people superpowers when they eat them, and it doesn't matter if they do stuff to your body that would naturally kill a normal person, because that's just the world that we live in. And as a result, One Piece cuts no corners in coming up with some really creative battles, and really intense ones as well. Plenty of great powers for people pummeling the shit out of each other. The only reason why this series isn't any higher up on the list, because I feel I have to do that with this one as well as Brotherhood, is because there is a trend to it that I'm not particularly keen on. Like I've said, One Piece does a really great job of keeping its worlds and its characters fresh, but the formula the writer uses for every story arc gets ridiculous. Characters get to an island, everything's chilled, we then learn there's some tyrant who wants power and control, we associate with a character who's likely to join the crew at some point, everything kicks off, Luffy gets stuck somehow, whether it be getting eaten by a snake, or falling underwater, or sometimes simply falls asleep for some reason, just so that the weaker characters can have a turn at fighting. The stronger characters have one-on-one showdowns with the main villain's top men, and win by the skin of their teeth no less. Everybody's worn out and can't beat the main boss. We learn something depressing about the new character who's going to join the crew at some point. Luffy has a one-on-one showdown with the big cheese. Repeat formula. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not really a terrible formula, and the details to each story make them refreshing enough from each other, but it just makes them pretty predictable in terms of how they're going to play out. But it works to its advantage enough, because I am always looking forward to the part where Luffy's going to have the main fight with the big boss. And after all, if I'm still watching the series after 300 episodes and have no intention of not watching the rest, it can't be bothering me too much. Overall, One Piece kicks ass. Now, number 6 is a show that I doubt many would have heard of. It's Planetes. Planetes is without a doubt one of the most underrated shows I've ever seen, and the biggest reason why I think this series is so special is because of its fantastic world building. The series is set in the year 2075 if I remember correctly, and it's just about the only sci-fi series I've seen where I really feel like this is what mankind will be doing 100 years from now. If we haven't nuked ourselves by then, of course. The jobs people do in this series, the technology that exists, and the political and environmental problems are all things that are very believable in this series. The series is set in a time where mankind is in the period of space development, a place for people to live and travel back and forth between the Earth, the Moon which has been colonised, and various space stations that are around. But space development has caused a lot of problems. For one thing, it's caused a lot of debris to build up in space, like broken parts of satellites for example, that go hurtling their way through space and crash into things with people inside them and can kill them. So of course there has to be a team of people, who happens to be our main characters, to clean all this stuff up as best they can. There's also a lot of poverty problems in this series because mankind has chosen to develop at a time it's not fit for all of mankind as a whole, and as a result that also causes terrorism problems. This means when we eventually get our villains, and I say villains very loosely, because when we get them, they don't feel like stock bad guys. And even though you still won't agree with terrorism, you still understand them because they've had to watch their people suffer because of the greedy people who chose to develop during a time that wasn't fit for all of mankind as a whole. So that gives you an idea of what the world of Planetes is about. But in the heart of all that, we have the characters, and it very much plays out like a slice of life series, which I thought was a great choice, because in a believable futuristic world like this, that type of series brings things home even more. As I briefly mentioned, the characters are people who have to pick all the space debris up, and these guys are in the lowest department in the organisation called Technora, who are the leading company in space development. And the characters that we follow in this department really are a great gang. Their energetic yet varied personalities make them a great bunch to follow, and just like in One Piece, they all have great interactions with each other, and also their interactions with each other are very believable for both the serious stuff and the more comedic stuff. Also, another thing that's really great in this series is how that we get to see two sides of the coin to the ideals of these characters. If a character has a big dream that they want to achieve, we also see the side to them that is lazy, and it gives us a lot of detail on why they haven't achieved their dream before. And it even goes into that if somebody got injured while they were trying to achieve their dream, that they'd be able to use that as an excuse for why they didn't achieve their dream. And that's quite interesting because you never see that sort of thing in anime, and that is something that a lot of people do in real life. If a character is very liberal and thinks that everybody should love each other, it'll put them into a situation that tests that and can show the more barbaric side of them. This way of doing things very much gives all the characters three-dimensional depth. Overall, Planetes just seamlessly blends slice-of-life characterization with great sci-fi concepts, which is more than enough to give it a highly commendable 6th place on my list. Okay, we're into the top 5 now, and kicking off said top 5, it's Monster. So why is the series called Monster? Is it about a horrible creature with 12 rows of teeth and disgusting fur and tentacles ready for some hentai action? Nope, it's about this guy right here. But take my word for it, this guy is scarier than any fantasy monster could be, because this is the kind of monster that can exist in the real world. It's going to sound extremely cliche what I'm about to say, because it has been said to death by now, but I am in agreement that Johann Liebe is the greatest villain in all of anime that I've seen. The way he manipulates people into doing what he wants them to by gaining their trust is just incredible. And let's not forget that he can knuckle down on the faults of people and end up sending them down a path of their own destruction. You truly believe that a guy this smart and cunning could easily be the mastermind at a company that he needs to achieve his goals by manipulating people with his godly charisma. And he does all this without any superpowers. He might not have a power level of over 9,000, but he doesn't really need one. He can go anywhere he wants just with his charm and string pulling ability alone. He doesn't even really need to resort to coercion and force. At least not until he feels like he's done with somebody. Not just the best anime villain, but he is also the best character in this show, no less. But that's not to say that the rest of the cast isn't done very well too, because also we have Dr. Tenma. Now who's Dr. Tenma? Well, he's the guy who accidentally set Johann on the rest of the world. So Tenma's goal is to search for Johann and put a stop to him so that he stops killing people, and also so that he can clear his own name, because Tenma performed an operation on Johann when he was a child that saved him. And what did Johann do to repay him? He killed all of the people who were responsible for holding Tenma back. However, because obviously Tenma's gained so much from this, the police suspect that he was responsible for the murders. He very much is on a personal journey where he has to weigh up his moral stance on life versus the greater good. The story mainly plays out in two ways. One, like a character study. This way we find out through various people what Johann's backstory was. We learn a lot about his childhood, giving a lot of insight into him so that we can learn what could have gotten this guy that way. For example, a part of Johann's past revolves around an orphanage called 511 Kinderheim, which behind the scenes experimented on the children there, and there is a lot of disturbing revelations like that, which give the series a very haunting atmosphere that you can't shake off. You feel like you're getting deeper and deeper into the mesh, just like Tenma is. However, it also plays out like a crime drama, where we see lots of people that Tenma knew in the past, or that he just meets and gains the trust of, that are all working together from different places, all with a common goal of taking Johann down. And there's also a big cast of people with their own objectives. There's Johann's sister Anna, for example. Her goal is to work out the mystery of both her and Johann's past, because she has amnesia due to the events that happened the night that Johann ended up in Tenma's hospital. And there's also Tenma's ex-fiancé, who he broke up with just before he set out on his journey to find Johann. Because of this, she holds a grudge against Tenma and wants to see him go down, but she just might know something important that could clear his name. And if that wasn't enough, we also have Police Inspector Lunge. He believes that Tenma is using Johann as an alias, or maybe it's even a split personality of Tenma's. So while Tenma's pursuing Johann, Lunge's pursuing Tenma. That makes this a cat and mouse series indeed. It's a very huge plot and the characters are all really well meshed together. In my opinion, it's well worth the 74 episodes that it is. Okay, there is an irrelevant one every now and again, but still. I know 74 episodes might be a lot to some people, but I recommend giving it a chance. It is one of the greats. Number 4. If you saw my top 10 anime dubs list, you're probably expecting this one. It's Baccano. It might be a stretch to say this is what an anime would be if Quentin Tarantino did one, but it's about the closest you're going to get to that style. And for that, it's one hell of a ride. Immortal mafia mobs fighting each other? On a train? How could I refuse? The interesting thing about this series is that in the first episode, we pretty much see how it all ends. We see some guys that manage to get out of some horrible mess, and we see some other guys get shot the shit out of and somehow come back to life. You have absolutely no idea what's going on, but because everything's so cool and these characters are so interesting, you'll want to sit through the whole thing and see what happened. And just like in Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, one of my favourite movies of all time, the events in this story are not played out in the correct order, but you wouldn't have it any other way. Everything just ties up so well in the end with all the characters in the story. You can say it's presented in the wrong order for a reason. The twist and turn this story takes makes it a masterpiece in how to break the rules in traditional anime storytelling and deliver something that is exciting, intriguing, action-packed, and a lot of fun to try and follow. And I say try and follow because I'm going to be honest, there is a lot going on with the plot and the characters, and it certainly doesn't help that it's jumping around all the time. But in a way, I suppose that adds to the rewatch value. You might not necessarily know everything that happened the first time you saw it, but you'll still remember who your favourite characters are, and you'll remember which part of the story you thought was the best, and you'll definitely remember all the bloody, awesome, action-packed scenes of people's heads getting dragged on train tracks and all that kind of cool stuff. So when you pop this sucker on for a second time around, which is inevitable since it's only 16 episodes long and the aftertaste it leaves will force another viewing, you'll notice something in the story that you missed last time. I suck so bad that I've seen it 3 times, and I think I'll still need another viewing to get my head completely around the plot. But hey, that's cool with me. I'd love to see the charming Firo, the hilarious Isaac Amiria, the insanity of Lab Russo, the badassery of Claire Stanfield, and the cool as a cucumber look Gandor again. And as well as having great characters and story, it also has some amazing animation. If I played the anime drinking game with this series, I probably wouldn't even be able to get through a 4-pack by the time the entire series is over. And it's only 16 episodes long, so there's no excuse not to check this one out. Overall, Baccano is an amazing series. It has a cool, jazzy and violent tone to it, the characters are all unique and full of life, and the story is completely unpredictable, except for the fact that you know how it's going to end. In my opinion, it's not just a modern hit, but one that I can see becoming an all-time classic. Number 3. If you saw my Halloween special, you might have been expecting this one. It's Berserk. Just to let you know, had it not been for the fact that this anime has one of the worst endings in anime history, and that the animation isn't particularly great, this probably would have been my number 2 pick, because aside from those 2 faults, Berserk really is a masterpiece, and I urge anyone to watch it, unless you're not particularly fond of like blood and gore and heavy violence or any of that kind of stuff, which is fair enough. You follow a brilliant rise and fall story about a group of mercenaries called the Band of the Hawk, who are just some commoners who are trying to establish themselves by doing a lot of fights on the battlefield to try and work their way up in the world. But the higher up they get and the more they get into the castles, they also have to watch out for the nobles, because the nobles want them gone for showing them up, which means that they're not just part of the war on the battlefield, but they're also part of the war inside the castle walls too. Many of the best aspects of this show come from the characters. They're overall just such a fantastic cast. They're all very three-dimensional and feel like real people. It's so easy to get attached to these characters. It would just take so long to explain what it is about every single character that I liked. So I'll just focus on the big 2, Guts and Griffith. At first, Guts doesn't seem anything too special. He's just a guy who just swings his sword around cutting people up. But he comes with a very disturbing backstory, and he is developed very well as a great lost character that I can relate to. He doesn't really know what he wants in his life. All he knows that he's good at something and he uses that skill to keep himself satisfied. But when he gets the opportunity to be part of something, he changes from being very confrontational and only being interested in fighting and not really caring about other people, to being a guy who genuinely cares about the people around him. And he also takes a lot of pride in the position he's been given by Griffith. But on top of all that, he also has to evaluate whether this is actually what he wants. Being part of somebody else's dream is all well and good, but he also has to figure out how to have a meaningful life that comes from something that he's genuinely passionate about. Griffith, on the other hand, is the big ambition character. His objective is to one day own his own kingdom, which is a very hard thing to do since he's come from nothing. But because he's so skilled in strategy and has a very good charm, a very Johan-esque charm I should add, he has the ability to use his battles on the field and other people as stepping stones to help himself get higher up the rankings. One big stepping stone in particular is getting in with the princess, naturally someone who would be very beneficial for him to be able to own his own kingdom one day. He very much has complicating emotions regarding his followers, where he can't decide whether they are just stepping stones to get where he wants to go, or whether they actually do mean something more to him. Guts in particular challenges him on this. As a result, they have a very in-depth relationship, which does end up becoming very messy later on in the series. Griffith also possesses the intelligence to work out who his enemies are within the castle walls. He's even able to deduce some of the more cunning nobles in the castle walls, and comes out with great plans to smoke them out, and all without exposing himself to others in a negative way. And as well as having good strategy in that sense, he also has great strategy on the battlefield, which means that the action isn't just all blood and guts, and of course that is awesome, but it's also a lot more tactical. There's a lot of great plans in this series, which you wouldn't think for this sort of hack and slice sort of show, but there really is a lot of interesting scenes where there's a bit more of this going on. As I've said already, the animation isn't really that great, but I will say that when the animation is at its best, it is amazing to look at. And even when the animation isn't that good, the artwork rarely ever falters. The attention to detail on the background art is exquisite, and the character designs are so good that there isn't really 2 characters that look alike. Except for maybe these 2. All else I can say is that I highly recommend this series. I know my Halloween special might not have shown this series in its best light, given that all that was showing you a part where a load of monsters were fucking people, but it really is well above the series you'd expect it to be in terms of story and characters. It intelligently analyses the aspirations of the human race, and it never fails to engage you. Unless you don't like blood and gore, or you're the sort of person that can't stand anything that isn't the new super fandangled HD graphics, and this is one that you have to check out. It's a top Nizinator recommendation. Now for number 2, Hunter x Hunter. It's in Hunter x Hunter's execution that makes it a fantastic series for me. Unlike in a lot of shonen titles, where a lot of the character development is done through over-the-top flashbacks that take like 2 episodes to find out about a character's past, in Hunter x Hunter it's very much done by going through the story and seeing how the characters react with each other and the new situations that they're in, that we piece them together, and that way it doesn't take away from the pace of the story, and we still find out everything that we need to know about them. And even though the characters might seem cliché at first, they turn out to be anything but. There's the main character Gurren, who may have an objective that takes him unbelievably long to get anywhere near, but it is actually quite a unique objective, just to find his dad. In order to track his dad down, he decides the best way to do so is to follow in his footsteps by becoming a hunter so that he can find out just what it means to be a hunter and why it was so important to his father that he'd choose to do that instead of being with his son. Most main characters seem to be portrayed to be pretty strong so that they seem quite cool, and even when they hit a point where they're struggling with something and they need to train to get better than it, it doesn't really feel like they've learned anything, they've just had to toughen up a bit. But in Gurren's case, he realises that he's way in over his head. You see him go through much more of a character arc because he has to be broken both physically and mentally before he can become strong. And as a result, you feel like he's actually growing up as a person because of all the stuff that he has to go through. Killua is a great character as well. He's a kid from a family of assassins and he wants to break away from that way of life in pursuit of doing something different. But along his journey, his previous life keeps coming back to him in more ways than one. He's one of those characters who seems to shine with his personality alone. He has a badass vibe to him, but there is also a playful side to him that makes him a lot of fun to watch interact with the other characters. Toppa has the whole tragic backstory where his family got killed and he's out for revenge. But he doesn't allow himself to become a shut-in where he refuses to be open to anybody. Instead, while he's initially quiet, he is still open to new relationships and friendships, even realising the importance of the latter being able to help you get along with your problems. As for Leorio, I really should have hated this guy, because as I've established earlier, I'm not really fond of comic relief. But even though he has a serious side to him as well, I feel that the comedy surrounding Leorio just works really well. For starters, the comedy comes very, very naturally. There's never a forced moment. There's sometimes like an odd coincidence that might happen, but all that does is just make him seem like a really unlucky guy. And there's just something in the way that he is that makes the funnier moments with him even more funny. I don't know whether it's because he's the oldest one in the group but acts the most immaturely, or whether it's just funny to see a short-tempered guy in a suit having such a difficult time with all this stuff, and the younger characters seem to have a much easier time with it. But whatever it is, I just really love the comedy surrounding Leorio. And then of course there's the villain, Hisoka. Do I need to say anything else than that? It's fucking Hisoka. I know I've dedicated a lot of time just talking about the characters, but that's because it really is the main characters that make this series so enjoyable for me. The story could be about taking a shit, and if these guys were in it, it would still be just as good. Okay, maybe I won't go that far, but still. But that's not to say that the series doesn't have a good story, because it does. So how do they become hunters? Well, they have to take an exam for it. Thought Naruto was so original. The hunter exam basically puts the characters through a series of tests, each with like a different theme on them. This makes for a lot of really great and intense moments, and not just in terms of fighting, but also in terms of psychology as well. This makes Hunter x Hunter much more refreshing as a show. You don't have to fill something with shitloads of fighting all the time to make it interesting. I'd take the part where Gon has to choose which candle he thinks will burn the longest, and the unpredictable outcome of that challenge, over some mediocre fight from an anime with characters that I couldn't give a shit about any day. And I thought the Hunter exam arc led very well into the one that followed, the Celestial Tower arc. One thing to say about it is that it's much more action-packed, which if that's what you're after, then this is the arc for you. And it's also the arc that introduces the powers into the series. In the Hunter exam, the abilities that people had were very much downplayed. It was more about tactics and survival and that sort of thing. But there still was very good foreshadowing through some of the characters that there was a lot more to come in this series from what people could do, which made it very exciting that becoming a hunter was only the first step. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the powers, which they call Nen, is my favourite power in all of anime. Not just in terms of the great variety, but also because the way that they explain it. They make the powers very personal in this series. In One Piece, if you eat a devil fruit, you get whatever power you're given. But in Hunter x Hunter, if you're a person that feels very trapped and you want to strip your enemies of their freedom and exact your revenge on them, then the weapon for you is a chain, with a chain jail add-on. And the Celestial Tower arc leads very well into the York Shin arc. This arc was just brilliant. It was very dark in tone, and it's an amazing revenge story which mostly features Kurapika. It's in this arc, when Kurapika's close to being able to exact his revenge, that we see all his bottled up fury finally break as he chases down his enemies with no mercy. It shows in a gradual way that once you're truly on the road for revenge and it's in your grasp, you begin to distance yourself from all thoughts that remind you of a happier time, and the only thing that's left is pain and despair, and the emptiness just gets bigger the further down the line you get. Now of course the series does suffer the same problems as pretty much every shonen except Brotherhood does, which when I say suffer, I mean that the series is always sidetracking from the main goal. It often gets put on the back burner while a lot of other stuff is going on. There always is little bits here and there, like every arc you do feel like Gon is getting closer to finding his dad, so there is still progress. But in this case I really don't mind, because I'm always enjoying what's happening with the story and with the characters. It did often create its own bits that weren't in the original manga, but most of the time it was absolutely fantastic. That made up scenario that they put in the Hunter exam when they have to survive on that ship for like 3 days and be able to find their way to the next arc was just done so well, not just in terms of animation, but also in terms of character immersion. I mean, yeah, you get some stupid shit like the arm wrestling. That happens a lot in this series for some reason. But yeah, in this case, I thought the changes to the anime from the manga were actually for the best. Yeah, sure, the remake's a lot newer and the fluidity's a lot better, but it's just something about the original that I can't get over. And also, even though the animation is sometimes not that great in the same sort of way that Berserk isn't, when it is done well, it looks absolutely phenomenal. Gon versus Hisoka, Kurapika vs Uvojin, those are two of my favourite fights in anime history. Not just for the animation though, also the meaning of the fights to the characters makes it so intense, and that's the perfect combination for me. A good fight can't just be a good fight with great animation, it has to have value with the characters. Anyway, I think I've gone on way too long about my second favourite anime. We've still got one more to go. But just to summarise, Hunter x Hunter does everything right for me. Brilliant characters, great story, some of the music in this series is absolutely fantastic, I should add, and it proves that shonen doesn't just have to be all about straight up fighting to be a successful series. And now for number 1, Legend of the Galactic Heroes. What I absolutely love about Legend of the Galactic Heroes is the story. It's set about 300 years into the future, and mankind is split very much into 3 factions. There's the Galactic Empire, there's the Free Planets Alliance, and there's also a small planet called Pheasant. The Empire and the Alliance have been at war for many years, and our 2 main characters are on opposite sides, Reinhard of the Empire and Yang Wenli of the Alliance. And both sides are fighting for different reasons. The Empire operates under the means of autocracy, or a dictatorship if you prefer, while the Alliance prefers to do things under a democracy. Now you might be thinking that the side that you're supposed to root for is the Alliance, because after all, us here in the Western world are all about democracy. I mean, that's what most of us live under after all. But Legend of the Galactic Heroes demonstrates very well that a dictatorship can work. And it shows that in some ways it can even be better than democracy as long as the person ruling doesn't abuse their power. After all, democracy might be government by the people, but that doesn't mean that autocracy can't be government for the people. And it's very interesting because it's the one time where both sides of the war are portrayed so in depth that there really is no good guys or bad guys. Through many multi-layered events that happen in the story, both sides of the democracy versus autocracy argument are analysed very thoroughly, and you see the pros and cons of both. In fact, both sides are so well analysed for the good and the bad, that the side that you end up rooting for could just end up being the side that happens to have your favourite characters in it. I know that's actually what it boiled down to for me. In my case, it ended up being the Empire, but only by about this much. Reinhard was just perfect. He's a great character to follow in his rise for power. His objective is to unify space and reach a position where no one will ever be able to take anything from him. This was kickstarted at a young age when his sister got taken away from him and he was powerless to do anything about it, just being a kid and all. And as well as being at war with the Free Planets Alliance, he also wants to do something about the nobles on his side. Reinhard hates the nobles of the Empire because they all sit back in luxury while the soldiers do all the fighting. Yang Wenli on the Alliance side of things is also a great character to follow. He's very slobby in his personal life, but he has amazing levels of wit and intelligence when it comes to his work. He's more or less on the opposite end of the spectrum to Reinhard. He doesn't even want to be a soldier. The only reason he became one was because he needed the money to fund becoming a historian. But because he happens to be such an amazing strategist, he keeps on getting dragged deeper and deeper into the war and gaining rank. Also, in his own way, he's very charismatic, very likeable to a lot of people, so he becomes a lot more responsible and has to look after his people. And also, even though he doesn't really want to be a soldier, he feels like he has to oppose Reinhard because he doesn't want him to unify space, because otherwise that would mean no democracy, and that's what he's a fan of. Just like with Berserk, I got really attached to the whole cast in this anime, but even more so here. I really could just tell you loads and loads and loads about all of the characters in this series, but it would just take forever, like, just so fucking long. I don't even know what the length of this video is going to be. It's probably going to go over 20 minutes. But with me going on about all these characters, it could easily go on for an hour. So maybe that should be a video for another time. And after all, this video is all about summarising my favourites, not making a meandering commentary on all of them. What I will say though about the characters in this anime is that there's never been a cast of characters quite like it. The series just has so many main characters. It's just such a huge cast. And it's not like they're all just very small moderations of each other. They all have such contrasting personalities. And let me just give you a warning here. Some big named characters die in this series. People have died in anime before, sure, but rarely ever do characters as main as these ones go. So, have you gotten sick of seeing characters get wished back to life? Ever gotten sick of writers pull powers out of their arse when obviously a character was intended to be dead in the first place? Have you ever gotten sick of a character suffering a horrendous injury only for it to not really have been that bad? Well, if you have, the legend of the Galactic heroes has got you covered, because when a big named character dies in this series, they stay dead. And that's not really a spoiler, because there's so many main characters in this series, like I say, that you'll never be able to work out which ones are going to die. Yeah, for the most part. The key word to summarise the atmosphere of this show is epic. The series just feels so huge, and not just because it's set in the vastness of space. It just feels so big with what's always going on in the story and the characters. And it's not just simply a series where a lot of ships shoot at each other. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of great action like that. You also get some great hand-to-hand combat. Some of them don't really make sense. Why they're using axes in the future. Lots of cool gun battles, tanks roaming around, tiny little planes flying around shooting stuff, and massive space stations with laser cannons. It has a lot of that to keep you entertained. But as well as having good action, the reason it's so epic is it has just such vast coverage of everything that goes in a war. We see how propaganda plays such a big part in war, and not just by telling us through exposition or anything, it actually shows us through a main character how it applies. In the same means, we also see how politics has its hand in it. We see how the economy gets into it. As I said earlier, there's a small planet called Pheasant, and their part in the war is to control the economy. If one side seems to be doing better than the other, they'll give money to the other side, and vice versa, so that they can keep the balance of power even. They really are the ones with the brains, because they're manipulating everything. It always comes down to money manipulation, doesn't it? And there's also just so many great strategies that the characters come up with, that's not just on the battlefield, but also just in the grand scheme of things. I'll give you an example. There's a part in the series where the Empire and the Alliance have a prisoner of war exchange. This was instigated by Reinhard, and what he does is, in the mix of all this, he goes to a former Alliance general, who unbeknownst to the Alliance has changed his perspective of them, and Reinhard gives him a plan to follow in the prisoner of war exchange in order to form a coup d'etat, or however the hell you pronounce that word, so that the Alliance goes into a civil war, so that Reinhard won't get any interference with them, so that he can deal with the nobles. And Legend of the Galactic Heroes is all about great plans like that, and not just who has the biggest ship that can blow the fuck out of each other. It's great to see a more tactical and strategic side to action, on top of good fun action of course. Sometimes the animation isn't too impressive. For the time it was made, that's something you have to expect. But when the animation is at its best, it is absolutely phenomenal, putting a lot of newer series to shame in fact, and it constantly improves as the series goes along. It's just a series that does everything brilliantly to me. Fantastic story, fantastic characters, great classical music choices, amazing intense battles, ingenious plot lines, phenomenal character development. The animation is definitely ahead of its time despite a few faults here and there, and for some reason, it never got dubbed. What the fuck is wrong with this world? This series is absolutely fantastic in my opinion, and you're probably expecting me to overly hype it up and recommend it to you. But I'm not sure I can really, because There is one thing that I think a lot of people wouldn't like about it, and that is that there is a lot, and I mean a lot of talking. There's a lot of political analysis and lots of dialogue, and even some exposition that isn't entirely necessary. The best comparison I can think of is the Lord of the Rings books, where everything is just so overly detailed. But in the same way, that also does work to its advantage, because it does aid in creating such a big, massive world. But yeah, if you're not a fan of too much dialogue, you might not like this series. I might not necessarily be able to highly recommend it, because I'm not sure it's for everyone, but I implore at least giving it a chance. It's a series that gets better and better as it goes along, and the turns in the story and the massive amounts of character development and variety is just something that's unsurpassed in anime. Hey, and just like with me, it could end up being your all-time favourite anime. Maybe not, but who knows. But all that matters for this list is that it's my favourite anime. And with that said, that's it. My top 10 favourite anime series. I hope you enjoyed my list and I didn't go on too long for you. I likewise hope that you'll check out some of these shows if you haven't already. Also, post a video in response letting me know what your favourite animes are. I'd love to hear from all of you. Well, that's it for now. Ta-ta!